Hello, everyone. I'm Ken Houck. I'm the DASV president. Welcome to the fifth session of DASV's Sustainability Innovation Series of talks. With that, I'll hand the meeting over to Kate Roski, who will introduce tonight's presentation and our speaker.
Well, I'm so excited to introduce Kelly Ryerson, featured guest in this fifth episode of the Dartmouth Alumni of Silicon Valley's Sustainability Innovation Series. As you know, since the name of this talk is Detoxifying the Food Supply, Kelly is an expert regarding toxins in the food supply and amaze you with what she heard. Before I introduce her, I just wanted to let you know to please feel free to write your questions for Kelly in the Zoom chat. We'll be sharing your questions in a 15-minute Q&A session following Kelly's introductory presentation and our discussion. So it'll be part of our time today. Kelly is a dynamic and relentless advocate for detoxifying the food supply, especially as it relates to glyphosate, more commonly known as the weed killer Roundup. She will help us understand the importance of Roundup-ready GMOs in over 90% of America's primary crops, and how that relates to government policies, how these GMOs affect our soils, water, and human health. Kelly is a graduate of the Dartmouth class of '98, earned an MBA from Stanford Graduate School of Business.
Apologies, I believe we've lost Kate again. Will you please finish introducing yourself?
So yes, I got my MBA at Stanford. I had a career in finance, and after experiencing some really horrendous health problems, I have completely changed my direction and have spent close to a decade now researching and reporting on the toxicity of the food supply, which is something that people do not often talk about in policy and in medicine and really across the board. So I'm just so happy to have this opportunity to talk to everyone about it. I will start sharing my screen. All right, so welcome everyone once again. Thank you so much for allowing me to share what I have been working on. The thesis that I work on and speak to on a daily basis is that our agricultural system is slowly and silently causing a massive epidemic of chronic disease. And our soil is nearing total depletion from all of the chemical abuse that it's been subjected to. And you'll see why this is no exaggeration. I think it should be first and foremost in everything that we're thinking about in environmentalism, in medicine, and in our diet and health. I first became interested in our agriculture system when I was struggling with my own health. I had an autoimmune-like condition that had no specific name, and it's something that a lot of women in particular seem to be struggling with, where they get kind of vague symptoms. And so I had rashes and fatigue and weakness and digestive issues, and I probably saw 20 plus different specialists, most of which were at Stanford, to try and assess what was wrong with me. And the only answer that they had was medications. And several of them were psychological because it was assumed that I was hysterical or imagining my symptoms. It was a really dark time. Then finally, I saw one doctor who said, I think you should try giving up gluten. And I thought that that was crazy because that was just a lifestyle choice as far as I was concerned, and something that you saw, like Hollywood talking about as being important. And I was like, well, I'll give it a shot. And it was completely life-changing for me. I got all my feeling back. My symptoms started going away, and I was able to slowly replenish my body. And I really wanted to get to the bottom of what this new epidemic is of gluten and food sensitivity. And I went to Columbia to a research conference on gluten, on celiac disease and gluten sensitivity. And they were talking about how they don't know what's driving this. They have no idea. They don't even know if it's the gluten itself. And it was wild. And so I went to the microphone. I said, well, is anything else sprayed on? I knew nothing about agriculture, by the way, at the time. It was anything else sprayed on our grains that might be causing this? And the scientists and doctors were mute. They either didn't know or didn't want to say. And then a lead scientist from General Mills, who was there to sell his gluten-free Cheerios, found me in a corner and he said, yeah, actually, we do know that there is a problem here because Roundup, the same weed killer that you go and you buy at Home Depot that's super toxic, is sprayed on all of our grain just before harvest. And then it's put into the food, and then we're eating it. We're consuming tons of Roundup. So I thought, holy cow, this led me down a journalistic path, and I began writing, reporting about our food supply. And I spent several months on the road meeting with different farmers in the Midwest, GMO farmers, regenerative organic farmers, as well as scientists at different universities to try to get to the bottom of what was going on. And when I started digging through the published independent research, I was astounded to find that Roundup, in fact, has been connected to a lot of diseases that we have today. So it likely won't surprise many of you that the chronic disease in the US is exploding and is certainly driving the $4.1 trillion in annual healthcare costs that we spend. Today, 6 in 10 adults have a chronic disease, and 4 in 10 have 2 or more. And what is terrifying to me about this is that it seems that this chronic disease epidemic is becoming normalized, where it's perfectly normal if you're on drugs. It's normal that your child has a problem. And most of us are old enough to remember a time when this just wasn't the case. Other trends in health: 25% of Americans have a food allergy or intolerance. 1 in 7 have an autoimmune disease. 30 years ago, that number was 1 in 400. 23% of Americans choose gluten-free. Now, this one I'm really going to highlight because this should be shocking to all people. 1 in 36 children in the US today has autism. 50 years ago, that was 1 in 10,000 kids. In California, 1 in 22 is on the autism spectrum. This is completely unsustainable. Other trends in children's health: 1 in 6 to 1 in 8 have asthma. Eczema is 1 in 5. Allergies, 2 to 3 in 5 children. Food intolerances, 1 in 3 children, my kids included. And obesity is rampant. I want to go back in history and tell you a little bit about where we started. The very specific cause of today's negative health trends began decades ago in what was called the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution was this massive technological transformation that took place in agriculture just following World War II. And it's characterized by a complete change in how food is grown. Chemical fertilizers hit the market right after World War II when the government realized that they could use leftover ammonium nitrate that was originally manufactured for explosives during war. It could be applied to crops as a nitrogen fertilizer. And pesticides like DDT also emerged from the war. So it's ironic that this is called the Green Revolution because it was anything but. And in fact, it birthed the whole era of pesticides and genetically modified organisms, which I will talk about soon. And the use of GMOs, pesticides, animal factory farming have expedited the destruction of our health and our planet. So we're in quite a pickle. So glyphosate, which is, I wrote for years as Glyphosate Girl because I used it as a pseudonym because I was concerned about Monsanto, who manufactured Roundup, coming after me. But then actually they sent a spy undercover who lied and said she was a mom blogger. And I realized that they knew who I was. So I stopped going as anonymous Glyphosate Girl and I became Kelly again. But that is my history. I named myself after this chemical. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in the Roundup the weed killer Roundup. And glyphosate was originally patented in 1964 for use as a boiler and pipe cleaner due to its ability to effectively bind to and remove minerals like calcium and magnesium and manganese and copper and zinc. And in 1970, Monsanto chemists identified, oh, wait, this actually has some herbicidal activity. And they first sold the formulated product Roundup in 1974. And so due to Monsanto's claims that this thing was safe enough to drink and it was extremely effective as a weed killer, it just took off. And today it's the most used weed killer in history. It's omnipresent. So that means that it is in the rain, the air, food, water, our bodies. If any of us provided a sample of urine or hair, it would have glyphosate in it. It was present in my daughter's baby tooth because it passes through the placenta down the umbilical cord. And when that tooth was forming, it was in there. It's present in semen because it crosses the blood testes barrier. And I had the opportunity to test 3 different semen samples, and all 3 came back positive for glyphosate, and it's known to kill sperm. It's present in brain tissue because it crosses the blood-brain barrier, causing neurological damage. So here you can see between 1993 and 2016, there was a spike in glyphosate levels in urine. It went up by 1,200%, the American population. Quickly, what is in Roundup? It's glyphosate, the compound that I was telling you about. It's water. It's heavy metals that were discovered by some scientists recently, some French scientists. and something called POEA, which is a soapy substance that goes alongside the glyphosate to help it work better. And POEA is extremely toxic in and of itself. It's banned in Europe, but here they still use it. So we just have the more toxic formulation. And in the 90s, Monsanto decided we have a really big opportunity here. What if we could create a genetically modified organism, a seed that could be resistant to the effects of Roundup? And so they developed the Roundup Ready system. It's a seed that if the crop grows like the corn or the soy, you can spray it with as much Roundup as you want to kill the weeds around the crop, but the crop itself will not die. So they thought this was marvelous, and they launched herbicide-tolerant corn, soy, cotton, canola, and alfalfa. Sugar today, over 90% of corn, cotton, and soybeans that are produced in this country are of this genetically modified variety. And in fact, they've become even more clever recently because glyphosate is becoming less effective. And so they've added 5 different herbicides, including 2,4-D, which is part of Agent Orange. Here you can see the explosion in glyphosate use in that time between 1993 and 2019. Today, 280 million pounds of glyphosate are applied to an average of 298 million acres of cropland each year. That's astounding, that dark, dark cover. As I mentioned earlier, pre-harvest desiccation is how we are most often exposed to glyphosate in our diet, because the farmers will spray it just before harvest. It dries it out all evenly. They can harvest it all in one big swoop, and then it ends up in our food. So a few different organizations, including Moms Across America, have tested various foods to see what the glyphosate content is. And here you can look and see that a lot of the grain products, like the whole wheat bread and the hummus, all these things incorporate pre-harvest desiccation. And just to put these numbers in perspective, studies have shown that 0.1 part per billion of glyphosate can cause non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in rats. So when we're looking at numbers like 2,300 parts per billion, that should be really alarming. Published research has shown a link between glyphosate and a wide range of diseases and conditions I have listed here. Really terrifying things. So you would think that the EPA then would say, hold up, this is horrendous. This is terrifying. It's linked to all these common diseases. We should look into it. But in 2020, the EPA announced that the EPA thoroughly assessed risks to humans from exposure to glyphosate from all registered uses and all routes of exposure, and did not identify any risks of concern. So those of us that were watching this just pulling our hair out and screaming. Meanwhile, in 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is a body of scientists that come together, and they use only independent research to assess whether or not something causes cancer. So no industry-funded research. They came out and they said, oh, glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. So that led to all the Roundup trials. I don't know if you've seen them, the Roundup cancer trials. Over 100,000 plaintiffs have sued Monsanto, and Bayer purchased Monsanto. They sued and claimed that Roundup caused their cancer, and most of them have won. A scientist who actually is here at Berkeley, she was tapped by the EPA to come and assess the carcinogenicity of glyphosate at the EPA in 2016. And she went and she said, oh yeah, this causes cancer. The EPA rejected her decision because they want to keep this on the market. They're so in the pocket of the agricultural chemical industry. And so she came back to Cal and she met with colleagues, and they published one of the most read research pieces on glyphosate to expose what she found, that it causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. There are so many studies that I could go through. This one I just wanted to highlight because it's so disturbing to me. Glyphosate is a sex-specific endocrine disruptor with androgenic effects in humans. And a study was done relatively recently where they tested urinary levels of glyphosate in second trimester pregnant women. And they found that the higher the level of glyphosate, the longer the distance between the genitals and the anus in female fetuses, which is a masculinization. It also it impacts the microbiome. It kills the good gut bacteria, allows the bad gut bacteria to proliferate. It depletes all the things that we take in probiotics. It's actually antimicrobial. I mentioned earlier, these are the different barriers that it crosses, things that should hold their integrity to keep our health. I wanted to say also that Bayer did acquire Monsanto, Bayer, the pharmaceutical company, and it really seems like a real conflict of interest, to say the least, when they are creating all these problems by selling Roundup and then treating them on the other end and making money from these treatments, including a new gluten that gluten intolerant people can tolerate, which makes me sick. And this is me. If you want to get in touch, I could talk about glyphosate all day.
Thank you, Kelly. Yes, there is a lot to talk about, no question. So many things to untangle here. Talk a little bit, if you would, about what happens to soil when the glyphosate is introduced, and what's this doing to microorganisms and soil fertility? And
yeah, it's amazing that soil has been so neglected for so many years. And I think a lot of people are just recently waking up to this. Of course, the scientists who've worked alongside the soil for a long time have seen it. One thing that is particularly stunning, and I'm seeing across the human population, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, glyphosate specifically binds to minerals, these minerals that our body is fully dependent upon to function. And what it does in the soil is the same exact thing, where it binds to these beneficial minerals, and it makes them bio-unavailable to the crops. So when the crops are growing, the things that we're supposed to be eating, if glyphosate has been used to clear the field before they plant the seeds, then you are going to have crops that are lacking those nutrients. And I think that's so interesting, because my feeling is when I look around the population at how just mental health is struggling so very much. And if you are not operating with enough magnesium and zinc and these other key minerals, then you just can't stay sane. And I just know that that is connected to this lack of nutrient that is now in our food supply. And outside of that, also, I was talking about briefly how it impacts the human microbiome. It does impact the human microbiome. It also impacts the soil biome. And the soil biome is so vital for everything that we need in growing foods. And it includes a whole fungal network that is so critical, and bacteria and this organic matter that also leads to being able to sequester carbon. That, of course, we're having a lot of trouble with. There's no need actually to have these fancy carbon vacuums that you might have seen in the news that billions of dollars are going into to suck carbon out of the air and put it, I don't even know where. In fact, some scientists I talked to didn't know where they were going to put it yet. When the truth of the matter is, if you heal the soil and stop spraying these chemicals on it, it's going to be able to sequester all the necessary carbon even more efficiently. So those are just some of the main things. And just anecdotally, when I first left California to drive through the Midwest and look in Iowa and Southern Illinois, it's the first time I really, it's flyover country to a lot of people on the coast, which is super insensitive. And we have to stop thinking like that, because farmers feel it. And I was stunned, though, to drive through and just see field after field after field of this dead soil. And I went out and I put my hands into it, which now in retrospect, I probably shouldn't have, but the soil itself is clay-like, it's not really even soil, it's dirt, and it's like kindergarten clay. And it's absolutely, when you think about the riches of our breadbasket and how we are so gifted to have this fertile land to grow things in, it's heartbreaking when you see how destroyed it is.
Do you know how any experiments to reduce that or to bring the soil back to health?
Yes, so that is when you hear the regenerative movement. So I like the regenerative organic movement because it rules out anything that's organic is going to rule out the use of these toxic pesticides. But even regenerating is a good word, because there are ways to stop abusing the soil. And that is what is really being discussed now. And it's things like planting different types of species. So it's not all monocrop culture of just corn and soybeans. That is really destructive to the soil. It's planting cover crops in between seasons. And so you can restore all this microbial life to the soil. Animals have a large part of it in livestock coming in and grazing and doing really focused grazing in different areas that helps to draw the carbon back into the soil. And so all of these pieces come together.
What's your experience with farmers in terms of how do they react to this kind of possibility of having cover crops during the off season, things like that?
So it's really a mixed bag. The farmers that I talk to that are interested in making this change tend to have had health impacts themselves. or have young children that have been sick, and they are interested in a different way. There are others, and actually a lot of farmland now in the United States is actually owned by people that don't even live there because they've inherited this from their family. And so they just have people renting it out and just, so they're not really connected with the land like they might have been many decades ago, where the farmers and their families were living on the land. Oftentimes that's not the case anymore. But there's some really shining examples of some farmers that are taking the lead in doing this, and they are going from small town to small town and explaining how you can get started. How is this economically feasible? Can you do a gradual transition away from chemical to, where you're regenerating one field while the other one, you're still depending on the income from that. And there's so much hope with the farm bill that was supposed to come out this year, but then the agricultural chemical community wasn't liking the way it was going because a lot of funds actually were going to be diverted to doing regenerative agriculture, which takes away, their money basically.
That's right.
But once that can provide a safety net, it's going to be really fabulous.
Can you talk some more about what your experience was with the EPA and other the testifying that you've done on Capitol Hill and convincing you attempted to do?
Yes. So I think that first of all, when I first got into this, I had absolutely no sense that our regulators were as corrupt as they are. I genuinely thought that they were doing the best that they could. Certainly not everyone. There are scientists there that I've spoken to are very frustrated because what they find often isn't what the end result is. But by and large, the experience has been not great. I have gone 2 times to the EPA with the organization Moms Across America to report some of these findings about the glyphosate. And we've also brought doctors and scientists with us to talk about these studies. And in front of the Office of Pesticide Programs, they told us that everything we were saying was merely anecdotal and dismissed us and said, thank you for coming. And I mean, we're talking about massive problems of neurodegeneration in connection with Alzheimer's and developmental problems and things, and they fully showed us the door. Recently, this fall, we went and we did a congressional briefing that was sponsored by Senator Cory Booker's office to tell Congress about what is happening in our children's lunches and how toxic they are. And that was fine. But then afterwards, we went to the USDA and we met with the nutrition policy people, and we showed them all this data of horrible things that are happening to our kids through the food that they're eating. And their response was, we can't regulate that. We can regulate salt and sugar, but we can't regulate these poisons and veterinary drugs that you are talking about here. So that we're like, okay, they said, you've got to go talk to the FDA. So we had a meeting with the FDA. We went and met with them, and they could not have been more disinterested. And we realized they're not testing any of this for any of these toxicities or heavy metals at all.
Why? Why aren't
they
they
didn't
doing
appreciate it. So they are not testing it because they know that they are definitely there's something called a revolving door, where these regulators, if they do a good job on behalf of the agricultural chemical industry, then they are offered these sweet jobs when they get out of regulation. And so they can go and have these really well-paying executive positions. So they aren't going to sacrifice that out by telling us, oh, you're right, these things are very toxic, because it's a lot of self-interest, and it's really disturbing. On the congressional side, and certainly also with most presidential candidates and people that have been in office, their campaigns are sponsored by agricultural chemical companies. The lobbyists are extremely powerful. In fact, the food lobbies are the largest of any lobbies that are in DC regularly. So when you have just a small group of men and women that come marching in, I think they think that's cute and send us on our way.
Why doesn't the media cover it?
So the media is not covering it because they equally are bought off by agricultural chemical companies. And it is so amazing because even during these Roundup trials, NPR was unable to really cover much of it at all. Like there'd be a little thing here and there, and then you start digging into, okay, well, who funds NPR? Like, I think of this as a really credible source for my information. And you start looking into it and you realize, oh, okay, Bill Gates owns quite a lot of this. You start digging a little more into Bill Gates. He's a bright guy. We like him in Silicon Valley. He's been so innovative. And you find out that he was one of the largest funders of Monsanto, and he's one of the largest farm owners in the country and is very, very pro chemical agriculture. In fact, to the point that he sponsors something called the Cornell Alliance for Science, which is an industry front group that pays academics to come out and publish pro-chemical and pro-GMO papers to get into the hands of regulators so the regulators can defend their continued protection of these terrible chemicals. So that happened. Go ahead.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. The reason they say that they support this is because they believe that it increases productivity, and it may well do that, so you can feed more people. I think that's part of Bill Gates' goal, right? To feed more people, to reduce hunger.
So that is, so the party line that Monsanto and Bayer and this whole industry uses is that we need GMOs and we need chemicals in order to feed the world. And that's some language that came out of the Green Revolution when there was a big sales pitch to make this happen. And it was an exciting time because indeed, in the beginning, when they suddenly had a huge amount of wheat that they were producing and sending to third world countries, and they were finally able to eat, that part was wonderful. What they didn't calculate is how it would be so destructive to human health, and it would ultimately destroy our soil so much that it's then barren and we can no longer continue to grow. And a lot of the arguments that are made that are pro-GMO, they're saying, oh, but this one's drought resistant. Well, this one, there are a lot of claims about GMOs, but when you actually dig into the independent science, you realize that any gains are extremely short-term, and you can grow just as much with doing it the regenerative organic way. So, I think they're going to grip on to that claim that we need this to feed the world because it's a moneymaker. They don't want to give it up. There's no money in not using their products.
So I'm sure a lot of our listeners are thinking, what on earth can I do about this? I can help. Is there something that people can do that would persuade legislators, persuade the media to cover this?
So I think that truly the best thing that the individual can do right now is for example, I've been now working, as I say, close to a decade on this issue. My ability, the fact that I'm here right now talking to all of you, I'm so thankful because this is not very common that major universities, even the alumni groups, will allow someone to come on and talk about these things because there's so much funding that's also going into the universities. So the extent to which people can reach out to their individual communities and just be aware of this fact, to me, is an enormous win, and sharing this information. The other thing that economically will make a huge difference is if you can go to your farmer's market or wherever you are and really try to buy organic food. Organic food is not going to use Roundup. And interestingly, you can buy something that's non-GMO, and so it doesn't have genetically modified seeds in it, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't been sprayed with all kinds of chemicals. So that does not mean chemical-free. Organic means no chemicals. Yep. So the extent to which you can go and buy items that are from your farmer and ask whether they use pesticides, even if they're not labeled organic, that then gives the consumer power to enable this whole movement, because the more lucrative the organic farmer, the more desirable it is for farmers to follow suit. So just going here, I go to the College of San Mateo farmers market every single Saturday, and I love getting to know the farmers. It's fun being connected to the food. In terms of actually protecting yourself from the toxicity of glyphosate, some specific things you can, besides eating organically. It's concerning because it is present in a lot of water. And so it is, as I said, it's in the rain. There's a lot of runoff from use in parks too, and it ends up in our water. But you can use a water filter, and actually most carbon water filters will filter out glyphosate. And it's not just glyphosate, it's tons of these toxic pesticides. Some of the fungicides and insecticides are actually worse. So really starting and thinking, okay, I'm going to use a water filter for filling my pots and everything is great. And you can use just even one of the pitchers that you have, or put it under the sink, or you can do a whole house filtration system. Those are all great options just to lower your general toxic load. And taking shoes off before you come inside, because sadly, and particularly if you have pets, so Roundup can go up through their little paws and give the dogs lymphoma. And it's the same with their food, actually. It impacts them the same way as it does us. But there's a huge explosion in lymphoma actually in cats and dogs. And a lot of that is because they're running with their little paws and it comes up. So taking shoes off in houses, leaving the glyphosate by the door is a good thing to do. Telling your neighbors, my neighbor across the way, I think she gets a kick out of spraying it because she watches me when she sprays it. But she, then I saw some kids running by barefoot, and I thought, well, now they've been exposed, just like these trials have shown. And finally, another thing that I've started doing, and we talk about this a lot in Common Ground, the film, is doing a garden yourself. This idea of victory gardens it's a wonderful time to do it. And I converted the grass in my front lawn in my house to a really fun summer garden. And then you're not getting the chemicals. So I really enjoy doing that. And so that's another way to connect with the land again yourself.
Of course, you have to be sure that your own soil is healthy to start with.
You do. And actually, I can send this information out too. I sent my soil out to a lab in Santa Cruz to make sure before I started.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of results did you get back?
It was very depleted, but actually the chemical load was low, but I had to put different nutrients into it to get it to be happy again and not too acidic.
So that's something to be aware of.
Yeah.
So I know we're getting a lot of questions in the chat, so I think I'm going to turn this over to Kevin to bring up the questions.
Hi, Kelly.
Hey, Kevin.
A few questions. Let's start with Cynthia Fallon. Can you speak to how much glyphosate/Roundup is used at schools, university campuses, neighborhoods, etc.? Is that something people can address at their own institutions?
Yes. In fact, I'm so glad you asked that. That is a really enormous issue throughout. And you see these pockets actually of cancer sometimes around schools where they are regularly spraying. And in fact, the first Roundup trial, the plaintiff had been a pesticide sprayer at some public schools in Benicia, and he had been exposed. And that you think about, okay, so he was exposed, but our kids are also running around these playgrounds where it was just sprayed. And that is a huge impact. And in fact, I want to give a shout out to Mackenzie, who is over at Herbicide Free Campus. She was a Berkeley student who was on the volleyball team. They were outside in grass, and there was a lot of chemical being sprayed everywhere. And she founded something called Herbicide Free Campus, and different colleges can sign up to get organic land care in place at these different universities. And she actually told me, oh, you're talking to Dartmouth, you should mention to them that they haven't done our program yet. And so I'm going to, because we don't want our Dartmouth people or any students to be impacted by this stuff.
Next question coming from Diana. What would be the true cost passed to us, the consumers, if we truly converted to clean farming? Would a can of bean be $20 per can? Eggs will be $50, etc. Would food price climb to an unreasonable level that majority of us would no longer be able to afford the food?
Yes. And that is a really large problem. And it is an element of environmental injustice that really just bothers me to the core, because certain people, of course, are able to afford to have organic food that's clean. And oftentimes those are people that are already benefiting socioeconomically from society. And others just have a local 7-Eleven where they can go buy food. And not only would organic food be too expensive, but also there's just no access to it. So one thing I can say is that Costco, if you guys shop at Costco, they have done an outstanding job of bringing organic food to a reasonable cost. And I love them for that. And they actually stopped carrying Roundup as well. So that is definitely a viable option. Because some of the farmers markets around here actually can be pretty pricey, and sometimes more expensive than Whole Foods. But of course, like back to the question, as more farmers join hands and decide they're going to be farming organically, it absolutely will lower the cost. Absolutely. A large part of the problem right now is simply there isn't enough, but even more than that. And this is something business-wise, there's a whole business now starting to launch in regenerative agriculture, because there are these products that farmers are sitting on, but the messy middle isn't there. In terms of transportation and milling and all of these different aspects that large producers historically have relied upon. So, but the exciting news is that the USDA actually another anecdote, the head of the USDA, Tom Vilsack, had a talk probably last year, and he said, my grandson can't tolerate dairy, and that's unacceptable. And suddenly you started seeing a lot of funds coming in to support regenerative organic agriculture because it was starting to impact him personally. So he gave a large amount of money and grants to fix this situation of getting the actual access to this clean food in place. So you'll be seeing that probably over the next 3 to 5 years developing out. And as that happens, you'll see the prices start to decrease.
Our next question came from Scott Fulton. Hey, Kelly, any comments on BBB permeability and Alzheimer's related to glyphosate?
Yes, in fact, a study came out relatively recently that showed that glyphosate does cross the blood-brain barrier and is now connected with a whole host of neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's, which numbers have soared recently. I mean, certainly not just due to glyphosate, but we do have the scientific proof now to show that it contributes to it for sure. It not only has been connected with that, but also other neurodegenerative diseases, as well as ADHD, anxiety, and depression. And of course, some of that also comes from the gut disruption and the gut microbiome, which dictates so much of what our health is day to day. And once again, just going back to this barrier issue, talking about the blood testes barrier. This should be really alarming. Fertility has crashed in just the last decade. I mean, it's crashing. It's down 50%. And you have these studies that show specifically glyphosate kills sperm. We know it's crossing over each time we're eating it or exposed to it. And it breaks my heart because as a mom, I've had many friends who have struggled to get pregnant and they don't know why they can't. And so much research connects glyphosate to actually miscarriages. It is changing ovarian function in women and in the fetuses of the babies. It is, as I mentioned, doing the androgenization. It decreases testosterone levels. This is going to be a true enormous fertility crisis. And something else that we talk about in the business is that we're starting to see Roundup babies, which is babies that have been grown and gestated when their parents have been eating glyphosate. And a lot of times those really negative results, including neurological issues and autism, aren't showing up until the third generation in rat studies. So the first baby will be fine, and then it's their babies, and then the subsequent babies that are showing a change neurologically and a change in their sexual organs.
That's very alarming. Next question came from Cynthia again, ask if you know there has been any progress discontinuing the off-label use of glyphosate as a desiccant. Not sure.
Yeah, as I had mentioned, 80% of our dietary exposure is from this pre-harvest desiccation. And it would be the absolute easiest thing to just stop if the government decided that would be okay. Farmers could certainly, and many farmers do, still harvest in the traditional way, and they're okay, and they're able to get their grain there. Some mills actually have stopped because internationally, a lot of countries, particularly in Europe, are not interested in having glyphosate in their grain. And so so much of it is exported. And so if we have glyphosate on it, then these farmers aren't able to export it, which really stinks for them. And so some of the mills will take in the glyphosate, or they'll take in the grain and they'll test it for glyphosate. And if glyphosate is present, they'll reject that, which is good because that is straight up from consumer pressure and exporting. That is putting that pressure for change. But it doesn't mean that it's not still happening. And in fact, they have replaced glyphosate with some more toxic chemicals to do the desiccation because those mills aren't testing for that quite yet, including that. Actually, there's several different chemicals that are linked to Parkinson's.
One of the members of the audience, I forgot, maybe it's Ann Temple, mentioned that one of the well-respected earth soil expert. His name is Gabe Brown. He mentioned that every acre of regenerated soil will produce 50 tons of carbon. What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, it is so phenomenal when you start adding up. It is just the most hopeful thing. And yeah, Gabe he's this fabulous farmer who has really been the leader of the regenerative movement. And what he is able to do in that is just so exciting. No need for these carbon vacuums, as I was mentioning. And and another thing with carbon markets, my feeling on carbon markets, which are sort of a hot topic, because I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how to take agriculture and place it in a traditional model, like a commodity model, which is what these carbon markets really are in terms of units.
Right.
And there's a lot of discussion within the investment community about how we just have to basically turn everything upside down of what we know and think about investing in these things in a totally different way. So those who are doing traditional private equity, like the returns aren't going to be the same if you're investing in land because they just aren't there.
Right.
And I think personally, I think that we've tried so hard to innovate technologically out of just create a new market in food, and nature's ultimately telling us like it's a no-go. That's what nature's saying. In fact, to the point that it's glyphosate. Nature is the weeds are outthinking glyphosate on the farm. So you have these super weeds because they've now become resistant to the effects. And sadly, I don't think people will, but it's amusing to me to see nature take control.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me back, antibiotics can only do so much. And then as a result, the superbug has been developed. Nature is powerful in a way. And we can never forget that. Our next question came from Sherry. So I know that non-Hodgkin lymphoma is typically attributed to glyphosate. However, has there been any research on the link between it and leukemia? I have lots of family in rural Nebraska area, and there's so many cases related to that. It's incredibly frustrating and sad. Their access to organic food is extremely lacking.
Oh gosh, it's so sad. What's happening in farmlands, and the glyphosate just carries too. The drift is significant. And there are actually some studies that are starting. Heartland Health Research Alliance comes to mind, where they're going into these farm communities to track women like a year before they become pregnant, during their pregnancy, and then follow the child for 5 years. But actually, my own in-laws both died from pesticide exposure in rural North Carolina in their early 70s. It was like a really slow death from ALS, and the other was cancer.
Right.
And so I am extremely compassionate to the fact that your family members are experiencing this. And there certainly are. In fact, there was a recent study. The headline was linking glyphosate to blood cancers. So I certainly would think that leukemia is clearly involved in that as well.
So next question, actually, from me personally, I play golf and I go to golf courses, of course, all the beautiful grass, green. What's their practice? Do you have any information on the golfing industry?
Oh my gosh, golfing is a huge thing. And I have a nephew who plays golf all the time. I'm always worried about him because in fact, I went to the Stanford golf course and I told them I don't think you should be spraying Roundup here. And I explained why. And they told me, oh no, go talk to UC Davis. They'll explain to you why it's fine. And actually, Davis is one of the most corrupt institutions in terms of agriculture. They get so much funding from agricultural chemical companies. So a lot of the plaintiffs on behalf of Monsanto actually were from UC Davis. So I was like, okay, I could ask them, but I'm pretty sure they'll tell me that it's safe enough to drink. So I didn't. The chemical exposure there is terrible. But actually, and I wish I knew his name, there's a Dartmouth grad who owns a ton of golf courses in New York, and he specifically refuses to use Roundup or any chemical on any of them. And so he has much more of like a Scottish St. Andrews kind of situation going on there.
Oh, that's
in fact,
awesome.
I wish I had his name. Like I was so impressed. No one's doing that.
Yeah. Please let me know after the meeting. Yeah, I'd like to know about his practice. Maybe we can spread the words in California. So if I have so many golf courses here. Yeah. So one of the members in the audience say, "Hey, so many people have a beautiful lawn. perfectly, manicured grass, but what's the story behind it is another different story. Turn it into a garden, it'd be more sustainable or drought resistant kind of garden. It'll be better for all of us. What's your thoughts on that?
Oh my gosh, I just love that idea so much. In fact, there's a group, the Neighborhood Food Network, and run by Moms Across America, or it's a coalition. And it's this idea of, can we all be growing different crops and then start trading like we used to? So on my street, I think I have one person I've recruited to grow, because I'm like, if you can do the green beans, then I will do the tomatoes and we can swap. But it is true, when you drive around and you just see these large amounts of grass that are not sequestering carbon. Like, for example, I don't have a huge home or a huge front yard, but I'm really proud of the fact that I have these cover crops growing right now in my soil, because I know it's restoring the health of the soil. And it's just fun to see how you can do this on such a local level and just such a small space. Now, I will tell you that when I first put my garden in, which by the way is cute garden boxes, it's not hideous, there were some complaints from the neighbors, anonymous neighbor to the city, that I shouldn't be growing these things there. And the city's like, well, that's crazy. You're obviously allowed. Why is that different than a rose bush? And I said, well, thank you.
Yeah, exactly. People don't understand in this case. So, Kate, do you have any more questions from your side?
Yes. Well, one thing is, we've spoken about possibly sharing the slides with everybody, and I think Kelly said you would be willing to do that. Also,
Yes.
we've talked about a number of different resources over the course of this hour, and it would be great to be able to share a list of resources as well, like the campus network that you were talking about, and several of the other things.
Yes, I'm happy to put those together.
Okay, good. We'll do that.
That's
Okay.
great.
Well, any more questions, Kevin, that you'd like to bring up?
Yeah, so I have a question on everyday practice. What, as a consumer going to grocery shopping or buy food online, what should we look for? What should we avoid on the labels, or where did it come from? That, what can you teach us about? Be more like selective.
Well, it's sad, because I realized that it should be grown in, or made in the USA, grown in the USA should be a really good thing. I'm not certain that it is, actually. When I am buying my pastas and everything are gluten-free, and they're actually Italian. They use considerably less pesticide there. So my suggestion is, with those kinds of things, with pastas, that you get European pastas. When you're drinking wine, sadly, the wine that's coming out of Napa, by and large, is incredibly toxic. And there are a few regenerative organic vineyards that have located farther away from the valleys, because you just get exposed whether you're actually growing organically or not. But by and large, you'll find that the European wines are lower in pesticides, and Australian and New Zealand wines will be pretty high as well, because they follow suit with us. Foods that are coming in from Mexico, they're taking a really hard, brave swipe at American agriculture, and they don't want our junk at this point. They're recommitting to human health and the health of the farmer. And so the corn products that come out of Mexico, I would feel pretty good about. Certainly, if you see something that's regenerative. So also, this is important, because you're going to start seeing this more and more on labels. And in fact, there's a rice that's regenerative organic that I love, that you'll see in Whole Foods, and it has a big picture of a farm, so there's no missing it. But what's happening now is the typical greenwashing that you see across different industries. So the word regenerative oftentimes doesn't necessarily mean low chemical, and it might not mean that it isn't GMOs, and to the point that the corporations, the agricultural chemical corporations, are now co-opting the word regenerative, because they want to still own that as well. So, but if you see something that's regenerative organic, or if it has a seal that is organic, or if it says regenerative organic certified, that is an excellent thing. But to be realistic, in my kitchen, it's mostly just things with the organic USDA seal.
Oh, good to know. For sure, the tips you provide for European origin pasta, wine is great tips. often see that food in Europe tastes better than here when I went to Europe myself. So I can personally contest that.
Yeah. Well, and as an aside with Europe, they've been really the leaders, particularly France, with keeping it low chemical. They still use glyphosate from time to time, but yesterday actually I was on a call with French regulators because it looks like these more sophisticated GMOs are being pushed through Parliament there, and so they may not always be low tox, which is very sad because that's my place that I like to go and eat.
Yeah, one of the members audience, Ann Temple, shared, just go talk to the farmers at the farmers market. And I think what do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Go and talk to them and see how they grow. And you know what? They're really happy to be asked by and large because it's hard. They're taking a financial risk when they're when they're growing this way.
Right.
And they're usually very pleased to share it with you.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for all the questions and the answers. Kate, please take over.
Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap up, and this has really been terrific. It's like drinking from a fire hose in a way because a lot of this is really new and it's overwhelming. But I know that if you provide the slideshow and these hints, people can start adjusting their lives accordingly, and that's really helpful. So thank you, Kelly, so much for being here today, and I think Ken is going to take us home.
Well, I'll really just say
Ken?
thanks to everyone, to Kate and to Kevin, and especially to Kelly. We really appreciate your entertaining us tonight and informing us. And the presentation will be up on the DAASB website in the next several days, along with the materials that Kelly provides to us.
Awesome.
Anything
Thank
else?
you so much.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
so much.
Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.